Hi everybody, this is Becky Koch. I am the Agriculture Communication Director at North Dakota State University, and here in North Dakota over the last 30 years I have experienced quite a few disasters. When I applied to present this at ACE, it was supposed to be a facilitated discussion, so this is going to be a little different doing it this way. I truly love learning from everybody through ACE, and so that's why I was hoping we could have a facilitated discussion. But obviously the world is a lot different now, and I hope I can at least share some ideas with you through this. So let's start at the very beginning. And a lot of us communicators aren't familiar with all the disaster jargon. I'll admit I've learned a lot about this kind of thing over the years, and I'll explain why here in a minute. But there are four major phases in disasters. Preparedness, which most of us have heard about, how to be prepared for a disaster. The response phase, which is really what is happening right when the action's hot, right during the fire or during the flood or whatever. The immediate response, that's when we think of emergency management and Red Cross and groups like that. The recovery phase, when we're trying to come back, and the mitigation phase, that's when we're rebuilding to try to reduce the problems of future disasters. And obviously it's a continuous circle, continuous with preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation, and back to preparedness. So I wanted to introduce you to those disaster phases right off the bat. I see Extension's educational role primarily in the preparedness and recovery phases. Like I said, right during response, people are not in that educational mode. That's not when they're thinking about what can I learn, but right then it's life safety is top priority. But as educators, we can communicate both internally and with the public in all four phases, even though it's a lot in preparedness and recovery. And even though I'm talking mostly about Extension, some of the rest of you also work with various disasters too. But I'm very familiar with disasters because of the Extension Disaster Education Network. So to put in a little plug here, I'll admit, EDEN, which makes a great acronym obviously for the Extension Disaster Education Network, is a collaborative multi-state effort by the Extension services all across the country to improve the delivery of services to citizens affected by disasters. Pause recording, please. EDEN's mission is carried out in a variety of ways. First of all, EDEN links together federal, state, and local agencies and nonprofit organizations. EDEN also tries to anticipate future disaster education needs. What resources do Extension educators and others need to teach about disaster preparedness or recovery? EDEN also simply provides timely, credible information. Just like everything else from universities, we make sure it's research-based information that's up to date. But what I think is the best thing about EDEN is that networking, simply connecting with other people from institutions across the country, Extension professionals, and those in other agencies and organizations too, because that's what is right in the name, the Extension Disaster Education Network, and that is so valuable to learn from each other. I wanted to make sure communicators were aware of all the EDEN resources. First of all, notice the new URL. It used to be a .edu, but now it's extensiondisaster.net. So bookmark that on your computers because that website is a wealth of resources that you as communicators can use. We encourage all the institutional members, which are basically every land-grant university across the country, at least the 1862s and most of the 1890s, and we're working on the 1994s. But we want all those institutional members to catalog the resources they have. Like I said, networking is a major goal, and so sharing those resources. In addition, Eden itself has developed some resources that are available to you. They're called courses, even though they're not like an online course. They're more packaged programs that extension educators and others can pick up and use. And there's like 10 or 12 different programs that are ready to go with the PowerPoints and the scripts and the handouts and everything. There's also a response notes, which I wanted you communicators to know about, because that is how the Eden delegates report to USDA. And we've been told that some of those response notes go straight to the, well, I won't say straight, but they make it to the Secretary of Agriculture and have been very impactful in making decisions at USDA. But again, to me, the best resource is the networking, the people who are involved. So how can you get involved? To become an Eden delegate, simply go to that website and over in the right-hand side, click on find your institution and who the point of contact is. And then I hope to see some more communicators involved in Eden. So let's get back to the basics of disasters here. I want to pause for just a second and I want you to think about the disasters in your state, for example, or your immediate area. Some of the types of disasters you might have to deal with. I'm sure already you're thinking about, oh yeah, we have this and this and this. You can just look at the Weather Channel right now. Ones I think about usually, being in North Dakota, being in Fargo specifically, are blizzards, and yes, go ahead and everybody else can make fun of our blizzards. We're used to it. Floods, which we've had quite a bit here. Drought, ironically, right now we're having flooding in the eastern half of North Dakota and drought in the western half. Wildfires, we've had to deal with a little bit. But through Eden, I've also learned a lot about, and I'm glad I don't have to deal with, hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, other kinds of disasters like that. So each of us needs to think about what kind of disaster we might have to deal with. Now, like I said, I sent in this proposal for ACE months ago. At that time, most of us weren't thinking of a pandemic as a disaster, but obviously it is, and obviously it's affecting our lives greatly. And what I want to talk about for the rest of this presentation applies to disasters of pandemics and epidemics, but maybe not as much as I had hoped it would, partly because it's ongoing. However, again, Eden delegates have been working together to share educational resources on how we all deal with pandemics and epidemics. In fact, I worked with a team to develop one of those courses or packaged programs on epidemic preparedness for community organizations. Ironically, it was initially called Pandemic Preparedness for Faith-Based Organizations, and the Eden delegates said, that's too narrow. People won't believe a pandemic would really happen, but an epidemic could. Well, and here we are. And also, ironically, to the people who say, you know, pandemic, we'll never have one of those. But Dr. Michael Osterholm from the University of Minnesota attended the Eden meeting that we hosted here in Fargo in 2005. And he talked about exactly what's happening now. The thing that kept him awake at night was a worldwide epidemic, and usually influenza was the example then, but some sort of a viral epidemic. So there have been some plans on how to educate and prepare for pandemics. Let's talk about disasters in general. And I want to talk about before a disaster and specifically communicating before a disaster with several different groups of people. And the first group I want to talk with you about is your own team, your department or your unit or whoever you work with. Because as communicators, I think it's our responsibility to discuss the different scenarios of disasters that might happen. We probably all have, if we work on a campus or in a county office or at another office, most of us probably have fire drills. We did in grade school even. Some of us had tornado drills also when we were growing up, but when's the last time you've had a tornado drill in your office? Because there's a big difference. Fire, evacuate. Tornado, shelter in place. Over the last few years, quite a few of us have probably had active shooter scenarios. We probably didn't practice for an epidemic or pandemic, but that's another scenario that now we obviously have a lot of experience with. But as communicators, I encourage you to just talk with your coworkers about those possibilities. Practice that evacuation and shelter in place. I even went to the wrong place for shelter in place. I thought, oh, this is a big heavy table. It'll be great if a tornado hits. It was the old video room and it had a glass window. Didn't even think about that. But think about those scenarios, and then as a group, a department, a unit, whatever, develop some plans. But also encourage your staff to prepare at home, because obviously we worry about our families. And if something happens while we're at work, our minds are not going to be here. We want to make sure our families are safe. So there's an entire Eden program on family preparedness that you can use for that purpose. Also, before a disaster, I encourage you to work with other communicators, whether that be on campus, in your state, in your county, whatever the case may be. But again, the first thing to do is just consider some possible disasters and situations. What are the top priorities that you might want to work on? I encourage you to work maybe with a local emergency manager or somebody to actually exercise one or two of those possibilities. Do a tabletop or maybe a full-fledged exercise, but just a tabletop exercise where they keep throwing additional situations on top of the basic situation to have you react to. But the most important thing for you communicators to do before a disaster is go ahead and develop that content. Don't wait until the tornado siren's going off or the waters are rising. So most of us, or a lot of institutions, I shouldn't say most because I don't know, although through Eden I do know quite a few, have websites with disaster content. For example, there's our NDSU website. Need to update it because it's still focused on winter, and no matter what some of you think, no, it is not still winter in North Dakota. But prepare that website, have media releases ready to go, because a lot of this disaster stuff is not super duper timely. A lot of it is research based that can be fairly evergreen. Have some radio scripts ready. Radio is one thing that we don't use as much as we should, especially in a disaster situation, because a lot of people will have it on their phone or whatever, listening to the latest. And obviously social media posts. Of course, the first thing that we're going to lose is our cell service probably, and won't have access to our social media. But I encourage you as communicators before a disaster to consider the possibilities and go ahead and get content ready, because it's not a matter of if, but when. Also, before a disaster, think about the teams you work with. So administrative teams, for example, at your university or in your county or whoever you work with, administratively especially. But number one, and this is obvious to us, but make sure the communicators are at the table. Make sure we're involved in the discussion. Sometimes we have to push our way in there. But also, there's probably a plan, maybe sitting on somebody's shelf, of the county or the state or the university or whatever. There's probably a disaster plan. And I encourage you to make sure that internal and external communications are in that plan. How will you as a communicator make sure we're communicating with those various target audiences? Make sure you know and share the resources that are available. Some of those administrative teams may not even realize all the wonderful resources you as a communicator has available. And before the disaster is the time to prep that spokesperson. You as the communicator might be named the spokesperson, or sometimes it is an administrator, but our job as communicators is to get that person ready to help him or her know the facts, know how to work with the media, know the situation. So prep that spokesperson before the disaster. Another group to work with before the disaster is partners. Obviously, the mass media is a partner. And as much as some of us don't like the stereotypes, sometimes the mass media still thinks, for example, extension is just agriculture. Maybe 4-H if we're lucky, but you know, what else do they do? Well, they probably don't realize that we may be a fantastic resource for disaster education. Ironically, I pulled up this photo from a few years ago, and it was South Dakota State University at a health fair talking about pandemic flu preparedness. So probably most mass media wouldn't think of extension as a resource for a topic like that. I also encourage you to partner and connect with other communicators. And one way to do that is if your state or county has a joint information center or a JIC. If you get involved in this disaster stuff, you learn a lot of acronyms I've learned. But it's been so valuable for me to be involved in the state JIC just during this pandemic. Plus, I've had the opportunity to share with the public information officers from the State Department of Health, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Public Service, Health and Human Services, Public Instruction, all those groups about the many, many resources Extension has and how we have staff all across the state who are so good at working with the mass media and social media and getting information out about disasters. Again, our communication skills go through our entire organization. So sharing that with other communications partners before the disaster, because as our old saying goes, during the disaster is not the time to be meeting people and passing out your business card. It's too late then. You need to develop those relationships with your fellow communicators before the disaster. Sometimes you know a disaster is on the front door. Other times you have no warning at all. But here in North Dakota, sometimes we have 2 or 3 days warning if we're going to have a blizzard. We can have months of warning sometimes, the way our floods work. But if a disaster is imminent, be proactive. Think about, okay, what's going to be needed here? And let's start getting this out. Activate that plan. I know you're going to get tired of hearing me say planning and preparedness, but hopefully a lot of this is written out. So start now to distribute that information, to prepare your spokesperson, to develop those key messages for staff to reiterate. I love this photo because it is actually one of our extension publications on how to build a sandbag dike that a family actually taped onto the wall of their house. So when people showed up to sandbag, the sandbags weren't just getting thrown all willy-nilly, but they wanted to build a dike that was built properly so it would actually hold against the water. So there's an example of where we nailed it, the timing was right, we got it out right, and they were using it. So when the disaster is imminent, really kick that plan into place. Like I said earlier, during a disaster is probably not the most effective time for education. People's minds are on the immediate emergency and probably not thinking about, oh my gosh, what am I going to do later? But it's truly a life safety issue. So if it's an extended disaster, be sure to continue communicating with those decision makers, your administrators and people like that. Continue keeping that spokesperson up to date and ready to roll, but also continue being proactive. That may be when the mass media is especially needing people who are good resources, reliable, research-based resource people. And especially during the disaster, communicate concisely. I know some of us have trouble with our PhDs, and I'm married to one, so I can say this, who want to dump the whole load, and we have to make sure, especially during the disaster, to be as concise as possible and give people the information that they need right then and now. After the disaster can be a short time, or it can drag out months, if not years. So after the disaster, obviously, we have good research-based recovery education. So communicating that is so important. This photo reminds me so much of all the multiple times we've talked about, you know, what can be salvaged if it got wet and what can't be salvaged, what has to be thrown away and things like that, how to reduce the mold inside your house, and so many different topics related to that. In fact, people got into their houses at such long stages. For months, people were finally getting back into their houses that we were just so tired of saying the same messages over and over and over again. And that was one of the mistakes we've made in some years, is we stopped communicating about some of those topics too soon. People still needed some of that basic cleanup information, and we'd already gone, oh my gosh, we've already done that a gazillion times, let's move on. But people still needed some of that information, and earlier they might have just been too overwhelmed to comprehend the information. Also, after a disaster, when we're communicating with the public, think about mitigation, which basically means rebuilding in a way that will reduce the impact of potential future disasters. So how to rebuild your house, maybe with better drainage so it won't flood as easily, or adding more gutters so it won't flood as easily, or something like that, or building a dike around your house, or all kinds of alternatives. But again, working with engineers and others, how our after a disaster communication might include not just how to fix what's here now, but how to, again, finish that circle and prepare for the future. How to communicate, I think, is so important, whether we're talking before, during, or after, because every circumstance is different. And as we talk as communicators in so many different situations, we need that multimedia approach. No one avenue is going to cut it. We have to repeat our messages, our key messages, in every media outlet we can think of. And like I already said, we may get really tired of hearing the same thing, but different audiences use different mass or social or whatever media. So we need to repeat the information in multimedia. So another little break from me talking and for you to think for a minute. I want you to brainstorm for just a few seconds even on the different communication outlets you would use for disaster communication, whether that be before, during, or after, whether it be for preparedness or recovery. Let's focus on before and after, not so much during, but just think for a second the different communication outlets you would use. So I'm guessing most of us would say, okay, yeah, social media, our website, mass media like newspapers and TV, our infamous extension publications, of course. But I think especially in a situation like this, we need to think a little more broadly. Billboards, we found, were wonderful after our flooding when people were driving to the hardware store to get new whatever. Radio, I already mentioned. People listen to radio more when they're building, for example. Have the radio going as they're clearing the gunk out of their basement or whatever. Some apps are designed specifically for disasters. In fact, we've developed 2 or 3 here at NDSU that have been very popular and have been working really well. Posters, kind of like that mini poster that was on the side of the house on how to build the sandbag dike, because it was very simple and it showed just what to do. And I'm sure you were able to come up with many other ways to communicate, to get out research-based education before or after a disaster. So in general, whether we're teaching preparedness or recovery, how to communicate. Obviously, one of the things, and this should be a no-brainer because we preach this all the time, but especially with disaster information, I encourage you to be concise and clear, especially when people are freaking out because they know the flood's coming or the wildfire is coming towards their house or the hurricane is coming or whatever. They don't want a long lecture. Just what do I need to do to prepare? If somebody just moved to the coast and this is their first hurricane experience, we don't want to overwhelm them with a 24-page publication. Give them a checklist of, okay, do this, do this, do this, and do this, and that will make them feel better. Keep those messages simple. Working with the engineers, I've had a challenge a few times to simplify this, and let's just get to the basics. What do people have to know? Not all the extra background of why. Graphics are so important. I'll keep going back to that sandbag dike example, because actually seeing how it was shaped helps so much, and how the base needs to be as wide as you plan to make the sandbag dike tall. So that graphic alone really, in fact, people told us that helped them realize, oh my gosh, I'm going to need a lot more sandbags than I thought. And just be creative. I think here during the pandemic, we've seen some wonderful infographics that are very creative, but very simply get the message across. I think my favorite is the one that shows the transmission if you're wearing a mask or not. If neither of you is wearing a mask, if one is and one isn't, and then if both of you are wearing some sort of a face covering, how that can reduce the aerosols. So think about how to communicate. One thing, and this sounds so basic, but we found it really helps to go right to where people are going. After an event, Lowe's and Home Depot and Menards and places like that, everybody's going there. So we actually had our extension agents handing out information to folks as they came into the hardware store. Obviously, we need to continue providing accurate, consistent information. And that sounds so simple and basic, but boy, once a rumor gets out there, it's hard to stop. So that's again why we need to be proactive and get the accurate information out there first before some of these false rumors get started. Sometimes that it does take cooperating with other agencies. I'll never forget all the phone calls back and forth I had with the Department of Health. Back then, even EPA and CDC didn't agree on how much bleach per gallon of water for a disinfecting solution. So at least in North Dakota, we made sure the Department of Health and Extension were telling the same story. So check with those experts and multiple experts so we're providing that accurate and consistent information. I'm guessing the staffs you work with will be doing some media interviews. So just a reminder to them, since it's easy to get excited, but respond concisely, avoid jargon and technical terms and acronyms. There's nothing more frustrating than in a radio program like this where somebody's speaking in acronyms and you don't even know what they're talking about. So remind your staff about that, and also avoiding speculation, the what if. Especially if we truly don't know what if. You might, know, I'm sorry I use so many flood examples, but obviously that's what I know well. But what if I don't get the water out of my basement? And some things you can speculate on, but we really need to be careful if we truly don't know what might happen. And obviously the pandemic is a good example. There's a lot of different models out there. So just extension educators who focus on research-based education should be very careful and try to avoid speculation if possible. As a communicator, I also encourage you to keep records. Document what you do. I know that's easier said than done because we get so busy with actually doing it, we forget to document it. Now, we communicators might be in a little easier boat because we have the website, or we have the news release, or we have the publication, or the social media post, or whatever the case may be. So we usually have those, although websites we keep updating and we never have older versions. What I'm always missing, and I'm guessing a lot of you all are too, is photos of your staff in action. I don't know how many times I've asked them to give their phone to somebody else so they can take a picture of our staff person speaking or helping or manning a booth or whatever the case may be. But encourage your staff to take photos of themselves in action. And you probably might even want to keep track of financial things, because occasionally there's FEMA reimbursement, there might be university reimbursement, county reimbursement, something like that. And I know we communicators are often in communications because we don't like numbers, but try to keep track of things like that during a disaster and pre and post for potential reimbursement. So to wrap up here, I encourage communicators before, during, and after disasters to develop those messages before some potential disasters. To be proactive, push yourself to get involved with the leaders, with other communicators, and obviously with the public, whether that's through the mass media or whatever. Keep the information simple, because disaster information, when people are overwhelmed, just simply has to be concise and simple. And provide that communication, the information, when people need it, which may mean over and over again. It might be ongoing. So this is not exactly what I would have done if we could have been in person, because as my write-up proposal said, the goal was a facilitated discussion where we could have truly learned from each other. So I at least was able to share some of my experiences, and I'm sure a lot of you out there could share your experiences too and add to this little presentation. So I hope we'll get the opportunity to do that someday, whether that's at another ACE meeting or maybe even at an Eden meeting if you're interested in joining that group. So thank you very much for joining me today. And I look forward to somehow carrying on this conversation about disaster communications.